My husband signed the house over to his ex while I was pregnant. I walked out with the baby and the paperwork that left him broke. I found the deed on a Tuesday. I was 34 weeks pregnant and exhausted, and I went to the glove box to get the insurance card for my prenatal appointment. Instead of the insurance card, there was a crisp envelope with my husband's name and a notarized quitclaim deed inside that transferred our house to his ex. I sat down on the curb outside the clinic and stared at the paper until my hand shook. The deed was signed, dated, notarized. My name wasn't on it. The mortgage was still in both our names, but the recorded deed said he was the seller and his ex was the buyer. I called him. He answered like nothing was wrong and asked if I remembered the name of our midwife. He told me it was a mistake when I read what was in my hand. He said he'd been talking to his ex about custody of the dog. He said the deed must be paperwork they'd been sorting. He asked me not to worry. He told me to go to the appointment. I went anyway. I didn't leave the hospital without calling a lawyer. My lawyer asked me to send photos of the deed and copies of our mortgage statements. He asked if I had access to our joint accounts. I opened my banking app and went white. There had been 3 large wire transfers out of our joint account the month before. 2 to a title company, 1 to a quick pay service. The descriptions were vague. My husband had never told me about any of it. I called him again. He said he'd been trying to straighten out some old stuff from before we were married. He said he'd planned to tell me. He said he was sorry. He also said he hadn't told me because he didn't want me stressed before the baby. He asked me to trust him and not do anything hasty. I packed a hospital bag and a paper trail. That night I pulled everything I could find from the house. Receipts, printouts, a folder with an old property survey I'd never seen, emails from a title company with his name on them, and screenshots I'd taken months before when he bragged about taking care of things for a friend. I copied the deed and snapped photos of the wire transfers. 2 days later, I filed for an emergency hearing. I was thinking I'd get a judge to stop any transfer, maybe get temporary occupancy of the house, maybe force him to explain himself. I wanted to protect our baby and our home. My lawyer told me to expect anger and denial. At the emergency hearing, my husband sat across from me and smiled like he was in a different movie. He said the deed was signed because he wanted to make peace with his ex after their years of drama. He said he'd been trying to help her out and that the paperwork was just a formality meant to be reversed. He said I was blowing this out of proportion. He said he'd intended to take the house back after she refinanced. The judge looked at the deed and at the wire records on my lawyer's laptop. The judge asked why a quitclaim had been recorded with our county clerk if the transfer was supposed to be temporary. My husband's lawyer stammered. The title company's rep had already been contacted. The rep told the court they'd received funds but hadn't completed a refinance because the buyer's lender had flagged the mortgage. The rep told the court the file looked messy. That was my first small, stupid hope. I thought the recording was a mistake that could be undone. The title company told us they hadn't funded anything. The judge ordered the title company to hold. Late that night, he sat at the kitchen table and cried like someone grieving a lost dog. He blamed his ex for threatening him. He blamed his dad for putting pressure on him to keep the peace. He blamed himself for being soft. He begged me not to ruin his life because he finally made amends. He told me if I pushed too hard, the ex would go for the mortgage and the house could be tied up for months. I left with the folder full of evidence in my tote bag and the baby still kicking like it was trying to escape this mess. My lawyer told me the real fight was just beginning. 2 days after the hearing, my husband's bank accounts were empty. Not suspiciously low. Gone. Payroll had been diverted. An ACH hold had been placed, and he'd wired out the last bit the night before the hearing. He said he'd been covering bills in cash and that he had planned to refill the account. Creditors started calling him at midnight. His phone didn't stop. He yelled into it, then hung up. He told me not to let those calls worry me, that he could handle it. He refused to tell me his passwords. He refused to tell me who got the money. Then a sheriff's deputy delivered a stack of paper at our front door and left. It was a bank notice, a judgment lien, a collection suit. It named him and listed debts dating back years that I'd never seen. I had the deed, the wire receipts, and his signature. I had text threads where he promised to give me peace of mind and then changed the subject. I had his ex's name on the recorded deed. I had a fetus inside me who deserved a stable home. I filed for temporary exclusive use of the residence and an order freezing joint accounts. The judge listened and signed the order by noon the next day. The bank froze our joint accounts. The mortgage company put a hold on any title transfer because of the order. For the first time in weeks, something felt a little secure. My husband sobbed in the hallway and said I was destroying him. He said the freeze would ruin his chance to get another job. He said he'd been working 2 jobs and all I did was make it worse. That night he packed a bag and left. He said he needed space. He said he needed time to think. I watched him walk out like someone walking into the exact consequences he'd been dodging forever. He called me later that night and begged me to reconsider the freeze. He sent a voice memo I didn't open. Instead, I took the baby's heartbeat recording from my app and listened to it until I slept. The next day, my lawyer asked if I'd be willing to let the bank keep a modest emergency fund available for the household because the baby could come at any time and I couldn't have everything tied up. I agreed, but I made them put me as exclusive account holder on the emergency fund. Then I found emails. He had promised to sell a rental property and pay off creditors. He'd signed the sale agreement and sent proceeds to a company in his ex's name. The property sale had closed 2 weeks earlier. I called the title company that handled that sale. They told me the buyer had used a shell company, the seller had signed consent forms, but had been listed as transferring to someone I'd never heard of. I called the county clerk and pulled the recorded instruments. My husband's signature was on a stack of documents transferring multiple assets to accounts and entities I'd never seen. Some of them were already funded. Some of them were waiting on release. Then I found the one thing that made everything clean and undeniable: a notarized email. He'd emailed a scanned, signed check to his ex and wrote she could pull funds when she had the title. I screenshotted it. It had his signature. It had timestamps. I brought the notarized email, the recorded deed, the wire receipts, and the sale closing statement to the U.S. Attorney's Fraud Hotline. They opened a case. They told me to keep quiet about the criminal complaint while they investigated. I thought about what silence would do for me if my husband had already signed our house away. I stopped being scared of breaking things and started being methodical. I filed for divorce the week I had the baby. It felt cruel and cathartic in the same breath. He called it betrayal. He told me I'd weaponized the law. He said I'd pushed him into ruin. He said if I wanted the house, fine, take it that he'd walk away. I had already prepared for that. I had already signed the emergency orders that listed the house as marital property and asked for an investigator to trace the flows. I had already put a court-issued notice in the title office file that a dispute existed. When the title company realized a federal fraud inquiry had been opened, they froze the transaction entirely. It meant the ex couldn't get funds even if the deed had been recorded. It meant the lender wouldn't shift the mortgage without clear title, and clear title was not going to happen while the fraud squad was involved. That freeze was the pivot. Once the federal people stepped in, the shell companies unraveled. Banks reversed suspicious transfers that were flagged as fraudulent, the buyer's trust lost its ability to draw on lines of credit, the sale proceeds were placed on hold. My husband's creditors suddenly had more leverage than he did. They started suing him directly. He had no liquid assets to pay. The credit lines he used were gone. The house was not transferable without clearing the fraud claims, and he had to answer to federal investigators. I watched him move from bluster to real fear in a matter of weeks. He was broke because he'd bet on a transfer that couldn't legally stand up, and he'd emptied every other account to make it happen. He messaged his ex once, begging her to refund the wires. She replied that she had used the money. She said she had bills from the pregnancy and moving and affidavits and rent. She said she thought it would all be fine. I handed everything over to the U.S. attorney. They interviewed him more than once. They interviewed his ex. They interviewed the title agent and the escrow officers and the bank officers. 2 months after the deed appeared in the glove box, the county recorder issued a notice that the recording was under review and temporarily marked as clouded by litigation. My husband stopped showing up to court dates. He started living out of a gym bag at a friend's house. He called me once to say he'd handed in his resignation at work, that he couldn't face people, that he'd broken trust with everyone, including himself. I told him I'd been doing the hard work of getting ready for parenthood and trying to salvage what he'd tried to burn down. The night before the final hearing on temporary custody of the house, I sat on the couch with our newborn and the fat court packet on the coffee table. The packet had my tax records, mortgage payments in my name, the frozen bank statements, the recorded deed with the investigator's notes, and the U.S. attorney's brief that said there was probable cause. I felt a tired calm. The judge awarded me exclusive use of the residence until the divorce was settled and criminal matters resolved. The judge ordered our husband to pay temporary child support from his limited accounts. The judge also ordered him to surrender any assets that were shown to be proceeds of fraudulent transfers. That gave investigators leverage to seize those diverted funds. On paper, I won. He was allowed to come to the house to pick up clothes with a marshal present, and the marshal enforced it with a watchful, neutral presence that made him look small and ordinary. He left his wedding ring on the kitchen counter and walked out without looking back. My lawyer handed me a stack of signed papers and told me about liens being placed on the shell accounts. He told me the U.S. attorney had enough to make charges stick if the ex couldn't show legitimate use of funds. Then the ex filed a civil suit claiming an equitable interest in whatever she could grab. Things got messy again. The ex's lawyer said she had a legitimate mortgage assumption agreement and argued the quitclaim was valid. My lawyer found an undated, forged signature on one of the mortgage affidavits. He found forged bank stamps on 2 of the deposits. He submitted all of it to the court and to the investigators. That was the real collapse. Her funding fell apart because her proofs had holes. Her quick pay company vanished when investigators issued subpoenas. The civil suit stalled. She returned some of the wired funds under pressure and without admitting wrongdoing. The title company agreed to reimburse the escrowed money pending settlement. My husband's personal assets had been mostly liquidated already, spread around to friends and payees. Those people started getting subpoenas. A few of them turned over cash because they didn't want federal trouble. He went from living in a friend's spare room to sleeping on a couch to living in a tent in a park during the cold months. People who'd been his friends avoided him. People who'd been his creditors called constantly. The divorce settlement eventually awarded me the house as marital property and ordered him to pay a sum I knew he didn't have. It also listed a payment plan for child support that the court expected him to follow. The court also allowed the U.S. attorney to seek restitution for the fraudulent transfers. He filed for bankruptcy. He lost more than money. He lost dignity, a marriage, and parental presence. He lost the spiritual safety of home. I gave him the baby's first blanket at the exchange, supervised by a court-appointed mediator. He cried and told me he was sorry. I handed the blanket back and said he'd had every chance to be honest. He never took it. Months later, the U.S. attorney negotiated a plea deal. He pled to wire fraud and conspiracy, got probation plus community service, and was ordered to pay restitution as he could. Restitution was a joke. The shell accounts returned a small amount. The ex declared bankruptcy in her own state. The banks clawed back some funds, but a lot was gone. Financially, he was done. He moved out of state and took a job packing boxes for minimum wage. I moved into the house with the baby and the court order that named me the exclusive occupant until the divorce was final. No one cheered. No one handed me a trophy. I put up the baby's crib, made a list of pediatricians, bought organic formula even though it was expensive, and learned how to swaddle with one hand. My parents tried to call it a victory for the family. My friends called it survival. I called it necessary. My life after that looked like midnight feedings and slow mornings and the chaos of diapers and bills and calls to the lawyer. The house still needed work. I still had to finish the divorce. The U.S. attorney's case closed with him accepting fault. The ex was mostly out of sight. The rest was paperwork. People asked why I didn't just take the money and leave everything. Because I wanted the baby to have a home that wasn't transient. Because the paper trail mattered. Because if I let him sign our home away and walk, that told the rest of the world he could do it and get away with it. Because I had a stubborn belief that the thing you build together with your hands and sweat and weekends mattered more than a quick payout. The baby turned 6 months old and slept through the night once in a while. My husband had a string of part-time jobs and a cheap apartment they let him sublet. He sent one text 6 months after the plea deal asking if the baby was doing okay, then another 3 months later asking for pictures. I sent one in response. I didn't invite him over. At times, I felt guilty for wanting him to suffer. At times, I felt bad for the way people whisper about him at family events. But then the baby hiccuped and smiled and reached for my face, and I had to choose calm over drama. I kept the paperwork in a filing cabinet in the office. Sometimes I pulled the deed out and read the judge's orders as if they were a map of how I'd survived. The house was mine now, legally. But it wasn't just a document. It was the place my child learned to crawl and say first words. People asked what I learned. I learned to spot a lie in a text, to screenshot everything, to have 2 lawyers on speed dial, to not trust someone who hides wire receipts. I learned which friends actually picked up the phone. I learned that a recorded deed on county paper doesn't mean the world if federal fraud is involved. I learned that the legal system is slow and messy, but it helps stop a theft. I still don't know how to feel about my husband. I am tired of feeling like I have to outrun grief and anger at the same time. But I know one simple thing: I kept my child safe, and the house stayed in the family where my baby could grow up with steady roots. That's the part that mattered.